Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
All right, greetings everyone, and welcome back to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Daniel Lowry, and in today's episode, well, we're continuing on with more in our A+ series, the 22902, for those of you keeping score. And joining us back in the studio yet again, lending his expertise to us so that we might learn from him, our good friend, Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes, welcome back, man. How's it going?
Man, it's going great. Great to be here. Great to move into more of that 902 series. And we've been really just focusing on security, right? In the last couple of episodes that we've done, we're in Domain 3.0, and we're talking about security. And in this one, we're going to talk about more of the Windows security settings. And there are a few different kinds that they call out on the exam. So let's go ahead and we'll dive right in. If you're following along out there with us, we are in 3.3 here, compare and contrast the differences of basic Windows OS security settings. And one of the first things that they call out are users and groups. All right, users and groups really are your first line of defense when it comes to maintaining the stability and uptime of the operating system. What do I mean by that? Well, back in the days of XP, right? We're going to go way back in time here, back to the early 2000s. I think it was 2001-ish when XP was first released. Okay, there was a user model that would really allow just about anybody to do whatever they wanted on their computers. And what I mean by that more specifically is the fact that when you installed the operating system and you configured the first user would be what's known as the default Windows administrator. And here's the thing about that. The Windows administrator, kind of like in our Unix-based systems, Unix and Linux, where we have what's known as a root user, it is the most powerful account on the machine. And when we say powerful account, I'm talking about privileges. Privileges, essentially, in the Windows world, are these system configurations that can happen, configuration of the registry, if you will, core security settings, core functionality of the operating system. Well, here's the problem. All right. After the research was done, they determined that most end users can do just about every bit of their day-to-day work, never needing that level of privilege. Okay? Now here's the other thing that's a problem with that. When you run as one of those administrative users, any software that you have is also going to run in the context of the administrator. All right, and again, what I mean by that is the privileged access to core functionality within the operating system, being able to make modifications to the registry, and the registry is very, very important to understand what's going on there. That's a configuration database. It contains all the configurations of Windows. And the problem is when you start modifying the registry, you change the functionality of the operating system for better or worse. And when applications do that and you're unaware of it, this is where viruses get in, right? And they start causing functionality problems, let alone things like driver installations, which should be just a part of normal routine maintenance. I don't know what routenance is, but routine maintenance. And in the days of XP, a standard user, your everyday user that didn't know anything about drivers could make these changes for better or worse. And also when they would download applications, these applications would take advantage of those privileges too. So when Vista came out, all right, when Windows Vista came out, they completely changed the user architecture. And what they did is they introduced something known as the SUA, Standard User Architecture, in which you had standard users and you had administrative users. Now understand, you've also always had kind of a standard user and you've had an administrative user, right? But in the earlier days in XP and prior, what we'd have was we would have guest accounts and we'd have administrative accounts. And the problem is too many administrative accounts were running when they didn't need to be. All right, so understand that users and groups are basically going to be, should be classified based on the level of privilege or access they need to a machine, all right, or a Windows system. Let me show you what I mean here. We've got a few different types of users or groups, if you will, all right? The reason I say users or groups is because users are grouped together based on that privilege. But I can also say an administrator is part of the administrator's group. Now, administrator, again, is the most privileged account within a Windows operating system. Not only can they make changes to the functionality, core configuration of the operating system, they can also modify things like your security settings. You also have what are known as standard accounts, standard users, all right? Sometimes just classified inside of Windows as just users. And with the users or standard user accounts, they have limited access, right? They can perform most of their day-to-day functionality, but again, they can't make those changes to the core functionality of the operating system, like for instance, installing drivers or installing applications that make modifications to the registry or run administrative utilities. All right, that's your standard user or standard user accounts. Now, in those earlier days, if you needed to give somebody some level of administrative functionality, but you didn't want them really to have access to every bit of administrative functionality, you could create what are known as power users. All right, a power user could perform some administrative functions, but they couldn't. They really couldn't, perform all administrative functions. Now, they're in there today. You will still find power users inside of your Windows operating systems, but I have to tell you, you're only going to find them for backwards compatibility, right? They're not used today. All right, and I'll show you that here in a second. Now, you also have a guest user. And guest users and the default administrator today in Windows and since Vista, since that standard user security architecture came out with the user account control triggering and stuff, guest users and the default administrator are disabled by default. Why? Well, guest users, if you don't, you can limit them. You can limit a standard user just by giving them a standard user account. And guests, you don't want them to have access, right?
Microsoft always made me scratch my head on this one. They keep the guest user account. They have it disabled by default. That's good, right? If I have the wherewithal to get into the local users and groups area of the management console, the computer management console, and create a new user if I wanted to, or enable or disable this, why even have it around anymore? Why not just remove it completely, and if I need to have a guest come in, I can create a guest account when necessary?
That's a good question, because they, if you look at like documentation and stuff and you find out, well, how do you limit the guest account? Well, first of all, it's disabled, but if you do actually enable it, it's limited by the permission sets that you give them. And it's like saying, okay, I'm going to create an account that has no access, and I just give it the exact level of access I need, where a standard user can still perform functionalities within the operating system. I honestly don't know why, honestly, you would use it. But again, maybe debate for another day, or maybe we can get somebody from Microsoft to let us know exactly why. Because inside of a decentralized environment, you might want to use a guest account where you have like a kiosk where you don't have that corporate environment where it's centrally managed and stuff. But
I mean, is the guest account any different than a standard user account?
It is.
Okay,
it's more restrictive, right? So the standard user account has a certain level of access to the machine and a certain level of access you have to different applications. Think about taking all of that out and then really just fine-tuning the level of access you want to give them.
Well, then that makes sense.
Right, and again, I tell you, I don't really use the guest account at all. What I
can't
do
tell you any time I've ever enabled a guest account.
That's the same thing. I haven't either. And power users are really just backwards compatible with things like XP-based software.
Right.
And in fact, you'll see that inside of local users and groups. And in fact, let me go ahead and switch on over here. I'm in a Windows machine right here. So let me go ahead and I'll right-click on our Start tile there, or our Windows tile. We'll get down into local users and groups. And we'll go into groups and we'll look at some of these default groups, right? So they'll actually show you, right? Have complete and unrestricted access to the computer or the domain, right? Our administrative users. You guys out there can always check out these other ones here. But guests, right, have the same access as users, you'll see, except for the guest account, which is further restricted. And that's it. It's just you can define the level of access they have, right? Power users, notice it just says for backwards compatibility and possess limited administrative powers. Again, this is about privileges, and it's really just backwards compatibility, because honestly, I haven't used a power user group at all since the days of XP. Again, but it is there, and you might want to be aware of it, right? Users that, now on the exam, they call out standard users. Understand that pretty much everybody is a standard user today, and notice it says prevented from making accidental or intentional system-wide changes, but they can perform most of their day-to-day operations, right? You say, run most of day-to-day applications, and that's what I mean. You can do most of your day-to-day work without ever needing those administrative level privileges. So those are a few different types of users. Now, I put one extra one in here because it isn't called out on the exam, but I want you to be aware of it just for your own benefit. Dan and I have stressed throughout this series that, sometimes we're going to give you we're always going to give you, some of the objectives that you need to know for the exam, but sometimes we're going to give you stuff too that's a little extra and it's just for your own benefit. I want to just mention briefly system accounts, because you do have two different types of system accounts on your machines that I want you to be aware of. And you can actually find this when you look in things like permissions. So for instance, if let me just take this folder here. I was working with a diagnostic and recovery toolkit. All right, there are times that the system needs to perform functionalities that happen in the background. And here's where you can see the system account. Notice that the system account is it's a user, if you will, but it's not an interactive account, right? And what I mean by that is we're not logging in as the system account, right? And you can see that it's got unrestricted access to basically to the entire system. It is the system. There's also another one here that you need to be aware of sometimes too, and that's called network. Network is another one of those accounts, and that's what controls the network communications in the background. So it's another privileged account, right? And that's why I wanted you to be aware of it, that it is there. It isn't called out on the exam, but just know that it's there. And I say this because we're in the context of security, right? If these accounts are ever jeopardized or maliciously acquiesced, I guess you could say, if somebody takes control over them, they have unrestricted access, just like an administrative account, and even more so, the administrative account still triggers the user account control. Guess what? Somebody gains access to the system account, there's no user account control that's going to be triggered on this, right? The system account controls everything in the background silently, and a lot of times you're not even going to know that it's running there, but you do have to be aware of it. Now that takes us right into our next subject. When we talk about NTFS, they talk about NTFS versus share permissions. All right, so let's talk about what NTFS permissions are. And in fact, you can see them right here, right? Notice that we have a permissions list, right? In other episodes, we've also called this, and a lot of operating systems call these ACLs, right? And rightfully so. An ACL is an access control list. It controls the level of access that a user, or as you can see, groups in this case too, whatever names appear in this ACL, what level of access they have on a resource. In this case, you can see the properties. This is a property of a directory that I have on my desktop. All right. And you can see that there are different actually administrators here, and the admin account, by the way, is an administrator account, just a username of admin. All right, understand that we have different types of NTFS permissions. We have what's known as full control, modify, read, execute, list folder contents. By the way, list folder contents is one that is only on folders. You do not find it on files. Let me show you that fact here by going to a file instead of a folder and going to the security details. And if we zoom into this, notice that I don't have that list folder access, right? That's just for a directory.
That kind of makes sense.
It does, right? Right.
How do I list folder access when there is no folder?
That's right. And what it does is it's kind of like looking, opening a notebook, if you will, and you can see that there are markings in the notebook, and I can read every one of the markings. I can read the fact that the files are there. It doesn't mean I can open the files themselves, right? So I can see what's in the phone book. It doesn't necessarily mean that I can gain access to anybody that's in the phone book. All right, so notice that you do have, again, full control, modify, read, execute, read, write, and, well, then special permissions. And we'll talk briefly about special permissions, all right? So what does full control allow you to do? Now, you might say, well, that gives you full control. You can do everything. Well, it's not as simple as that, right? As simple as it sounds, you have to know what it allows you to do. Full control not only gives you full, like being able to modify, read, execute, write, and everything below it. It allows you to view permissions. It allows you to take control over the file. If I have full control over a file, I don't care if it's Dan's. Owners, by the way, have full control over the files and folders they create. But if I have full control, I don't have to own it. I can take control over it, and I can give it to somebody else. And that's why I said it's not just as simple as saying, oh, well, full control means you have full control. You have to know on the exam what the potential is for somebody that has full control over a document or a folder. Now, what does modify do? Modify also allows you to view the permissions. It allows you to make modifications, if you will. It allows you to overwrite, make changes to a file or a folder. Doesn't allow you to take ownership, and it doesn't allow you to take permissions or change permissions. But I will tell you, I want to compare it right away. I'm going to go down the list to write. All right, write permission. Write and modify sound very, very similar, right? Because write allows you to make changes. Well, guess what? So does modify. So what's the difference? Modify not only allows you to make changes, but if you have modify, it allows you to also delete a file or delete a folder. And that's one big difference here, right? So let me give you an example where you might use a modify permission over a write permission or vice versa, all right? Let's say Dan's the instructor, and I'm like the teacher helper, if you will, instructor's helper, all right? Well, Dan might want to give me modify permissions because he says, Wes, I trust you, and you can delete some of the files, right? Once you tell me that you've handed me copies of these files, I've graded them, you can go ahead and delete them, and we'll move on to the next week. But imagine somebody that's in that class that he just wants to be able to add their answers to a file that's in that folder. I don't want them to be able to delete the file because I want to know, well, was it my mistake that the file wasn't there? I don't want them to be able to have the excuse, well, the file wasn't there, I couldn't add my answers. No, I want to know that you were delinquent on your answers because I didn't give you the ability to delete it. It's there, it's empty, it's your fault. Right, so that might be a case where you want to give somebody modify. Maybe the instructor student, you want them to be able to clear the folder after you've passed on a copy of the file to somebody, but the people that are in the class, you don't want to be able to make any deletions to within that folder. All right, read and execute is required in order to not only view a document, but if it's an application, to be able to execute it. That's why the term read and execute. And it does imply that you have the read permission. Read permission means exactly that. It means I can view the document, I can view what's in it, but I cannot make any modifications to it or any overwrites, changes to it. Now, special permissions, let's be careful with that, because in special permissions, that's where you get very granular, right? These are what are known as basic NTFS permissions, the default NTFS permissions, but each one of these individual permissions are made up of a granular subset of permissions. Like, for instance, full control. I told you, take ownership, change permissions, right? There's more things than you can do with full control than just modify, read, execute, read, and write, all right? So Microsoft says, use special permissions sparingly, but if you really need to fine-tune things, you can get in there and you can fine-tune things, okay? Now, let me talk a little bit about this allow and deny column, right?
That's very interesting because you look at it and you think, well, if I've got allow and that's checked off, that means you can do it. And then if I don't want them to have access to it, I would click deny. But as you'll see throughout, as you work through different things, you start looking at these ACLs. If it's unchecked on the allow side, you also don't have permissions. So that begs the question, Wes, what is so special about that deny column?
Well, that's a great question. Use deny sparingly, right? Because I want you to think of it as a dinner reservation. Let's say that this ACL or this permissions list that we're looking at, let's say it was dinner reservations, all right? And let's say the restaurant has a strict reservation-only policy, all right? Well, there's a couple of ways that you can be denied access to the restaurant, right? If you're on the list, allow, sure, come in, sit down, we got a table ready for you. But if you're not on the list, let's say there's no check mark, well, you're not allowed access. It doesn't mean that you're restricted from going in, it just means that you forgot to call ahead of time and gain access. But let's say you've been a customer before and you've been problematic, and I see on that list that you're denied access. At this point, it means I don't care if you've called or not, you will not have access. It's the difference between what's known as an implicit deny and an explicit deny. In security, when we talk about an implicit deny, it means you just don't have a check mark here in the list. You just don't have a reservation. But an explicit deny means you are not allowed in this building. You are not allowed to view this file. And you have to be very careful because an explicit, whatever it is, an explicit deny trumps everything else. So you got to be very careful with that, all right? Because permissions can be applied to users individually and they can be applied to groups. And a user could be in multiple groups. One of the things they say to manage permissions easier is to create a group and the level of access you need. You group your users together and just add the permission to the group. Because what happens is when you assign a permission to a group and you put a user in the group, it's called permission propagation, right? it propagates to everybody that's within that group. And rather than having to manage permissions on a user by user by user basis, which really becomes an administrative nightmare, I can just create a group. If I know somebody needs read access to a file, well, I'll just create a group. Maybe I'll call it marketing_read, and I'll grab everybody, every user account that needs read access, drop them right into that group, and guess what? Now it propagates to the user, to the users that are within that group. Now we also have what's known as permission inheritance. And permission inheritance means that maybe you have a folder, all right? And inside of that folder, you have another folder, and I assign a permission to, let's say, one folder, and then when I look in here, I see that there's another folder in here. All right, well, permission inheritance means that, let me go ahead and jump in this folder here real quick, all right? You can kind of see our tree, our hierarchy. All right, well, permission inheritance means that if I assign a permission to users, it also inherits to admin, which inherits to desktop, which inherits to Dart 8.1, which inherits to x64. It's called permission inheritance. Now, this is a really good way that you can manage your permissions as well, just like grouping your users together and giving a permission to the group instead of individually, 100 users. Well, imagine if I had 100 files. And for 100 files, I wanted to have read permission. Well, rather than going to each one of those 100 files, what I do is I just give permissions. Let's say here at Dart, I give the read permission on that folder. Now what I can do is I can take all 100 files and I can drop them right into the Dart folder, and it inherits right down to those files. All right, it's called permission inheritance. All right, and it's a great way that you can control permissions without having to do it on a file by file basis. Now, one of the ways that you can see an inherited permission, if I get back to, this is my users and groups, let me get back to that folder there. Because believe it or not, there's a lot of things that are being shown us, and maybe we don't realize it just in this ACL or this permissions list. Notice how I have this check mark right here, and these check marks are kind of light gray. That's what's known as an inherited permission, right? When it's got that lighter gray color. Let me see if I can show you guys. I'll tell you what, we'll bring up File Explorer here. Hopefully. We'll bring up a couple of File Explorers, and I'll go to Documents, all right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new, let's create a new folder, all right? And this new folder I'll call Permissions Test. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open it up and I'm going to look at security. Now I haven't set a single permission on this, Dan. Notice I just created the folder. But when I right click on it and I go to the security tab where we have our NTFS permission ACL, I notice that there are some gray check marks already. Remember I said permission inheritance? That means right away permissions have applied. They have inherited or propagated down to this folder without me having to do anything. All right, and if I go ahead and I get into this folder, and let's say I right click and I create a new file, and I'll call this, I'll try to call it something that's English, permission, and I right click and I choose properties and I go to the security tab again. What's going on here? I already have permissions and I haven't set any permissions. Again, notice how it's propagating, it's inheriting down. And I can see that these are kind of light gray. Well, what's the difference between that and that's an implicit permission? An inherited permission is also called implicit because I didn't explicitly set it. Let me show you how you can see the difference. All right, let's go ahead, and what we're going to do is we're going to edit this ACL. In this fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add, I think I'll add Dan. We'll add Dan to this list. All right, and I say, you know what? I want Dan to have read and execute permissions. And I choose OK, and I choose OK. Now, if I right-click and I choose Properties again, and I choose Security, notice that the admin account, my account that I'm logged into, or administrators have all gray check marks here. Again, these are inherited permissions. But if I go to Dan's name here in the ACL, there's a difference. Notice the difference in color here? I've got a darker color here. That's an explicit permission. And that's important. And why is it important? Because it depends on what you do with this file. All right? And that's when we get into copying a file versus moving files, because that is something you have to keep in mind. If you're copying a file from one location to another, essentially what you're doing is you're creating a new file. And when you create a new file, what happens is it inherits the permissions of its target. All right, and you also have to understand too that moving a file can have an effect on its permissions as well. Now, let's look at that, all right? So let me go ahead, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this file, and notice that it's in the documents and permissions, right? But I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to change this from permission, or excuse me, I'm going to copy this, right-click and copy. And I want you to keep in mind, Dan's permission, Dan's name was in that list. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy it over to Downloads, and we'll just paste it here. And we'll right-click, and we'll choose Properties. And we'll choose the Security tab. Well, wait a second. Where'd Dan's name go? It's gone. Why? Because copying creates a new file. All right, and in copying and creating a new file, it inherits the permissions of its target, just like I showed you, just like I told you. And in its target location, if I was to go to Downloads, and in fact we'll do it from this side, and right-click and choose Properties, and go to the Security tab, Dan isn't in the list. And it's inheriting its target. Now, how about moving? Does moving do the same thing? Well, I don't know. Let's find out. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll just go ahead, we'll delete all of this, and we'll go back to the Documents folder and back to the Permissions Test location. And if I right-click again and I choose Properties, it should still be in the same location, and yes, I do see Inherited Permissions, and I still see Dan's name in the list because I wanted Dan to have Read and Execute. I got some software in here and he needs to be able to execute it. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and I'll take this and I'm going to move this file. All right, I'm going to move it. And I'm going to move it to Downloads. And it's gone. Well, let's see what happened to the permissions now. I'm going to right-click and I'm going to choose Properties, and I'm going to choose the Security tab. Wait a second. Dan's name's still in the list. See, I didn't create a new file here. And I moved it within the same NTF volume. And because of that, it inherits the permissions of its target, just like it did before. But I want you to notice something. Explicit permissions, and this is why I'm taking the time to tell you the difference between an implicit, it's inherited. I didn't set it. It was already set for me. It's implicit. And an explicit setting. An explicit setting is going to be retained when you're moving within the same NTFS volume. So because I moved this file, according to the master file table, it hasn't changed locations. The pointers move for visualization in the graphical user interface, but under the subsystem within the NTFS permissions, it hasn't changed anything.
Wes, I can hear you in my mind going, exam alert, right?
Yes,
this
sir.
can definitely be a great question that they'll probably throw at you on the exam.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
Now let me also show you, now that we got a good calm pond of understanding, let me throw a rock in it, right? Because there is one thing that would happen. Let me go ahead, I'm going to do a control, Windows key Z, and you'll, oh my God, what happened? Well, I just actually moved it back to the original location, right? So I undid my changes here, and if I look at Properties, go back to the Security tab, notice I still have those original inherited permissions, and I have Dan's explicit permissions. I just moved it back to where it was. Here's one I do not want you to get wrong. Notice we're in local disk C, by the way. Let me make mention of that. We're in one volume. What happens if you move it across NTFS volumes? Well, let's find out. Notice I have another hard drive in here, and it's called local disk Z. All right, and that's where from our file history episodes where we were using file history. Let me go back to permissions test, and I'm going to do a drag and drop here. And I'm going to drag this down to local disk Z and drop it there. All right, it's sure enough, it's there. Notice when I move, though, notice what happened? It's still in the original location, so what happened when I moved it to local disk Z? I don't know, let's find out. Let's right-click on the permissions file, let's choose Properties, let's look at the Security tab. Well, sure enough, Dan's name is gone again. When you move across NTFS volumes, you've essentially created a new file, and it inherits the target volume's permissions. So you want an easy way to remember this one, ladies and gentlemen? Because I've given you 4 different scenarios here. Easiest way to remember it, the only time it retains permissions is with explicit permissions moved within the same volume. That's all I want you to remember. All other scenarios on the exam, it's where you send it that it's going to inherit. Now, Dan, I know there's a lot more that we have to get to because we haven't even talked about shared permissions, but I know what I have done and talked a lot.
Yeah, you definitely had a lot to say because this is a very difficult concept if you don't grasp it like Wes was trying to, and masterfully so, with letting you know that there's only really one derivation from inheriting permissions, and that's if you move with inside the same volume, right? If you remember that one simple fact, you should be able to get any of those questions correct. So make sure you drill that into the brain. But it is just a bit of a breadth for us to go through. So it does take up some time, but that's okay. We'll move into a part 2 to get the rest of it. Wes, we do appreciate your time and effort on this.
Absolutely.
We do thank you, good audience member out there, for watching, but it is time for us to sign off for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Wes Bryan.
We'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.